This is a production of PBS Charlotte.
Flash, Washington. The White House announces Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor.
People were stunned.
A lot of sacrifices made during the war.
By those in uniform.
I had no idea we'd ever make it back home.
As well as those on the home front.
They gave up a lot also to make that war effort possible.
World War II forged a generation of Americans.
Everybody was interested in doing something, no matter how small, to help the war effort.
And a sense of duty fueled American resolve.
The thing that we wanted most of all was to defend our liberty.
Families watched soldiers go off to fight. Industry ramped up. Women took factory jobs, and a nation did without. That's all coming up right here on A Trail of History.
The following episode of Trail of History is brought to you by Central Piedmont Community College and viewers like you. Thank you.
Bragg Financial Advisors, a family-owned wealth management firm providing investment management and tax and estate planning for families, individuals, and institutions for more than 50 years, committed to our clients, to education, and our community.
Hello, I'm Tony Zeiss, president of Central Piedmont Community College. You know, the rich and diverse history of the Charlotte region is just wonderful, and we at the college want to bring it to you and share it. We understand the importance of history. We understand the importance of learning from the past so that we can do better in the future. I want to tell you that you're in for a real treat. The History Department at Central Piedmont Community College has partnered with our television station to bring you this special, one-of-a-kind history program. Stay tuned. I'm sure you're going to enjoy it.
Hi, I'm Gary Ritter, and welcome to A Trail of History. Hitler's invasion of Poland in September of 1939 ignited World War II. And while the U.S. initially resisted entering the conflict, preparations were made. Just prior to the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, over 400,000 soldiers took part in war games right here in the Carolinas.
During the autumn months of 1941, in the states of North and South Carolina, the United States Army held extensive peacetime maneuvers.
The large maneuver in the area that brought the most soldiers here and exposed them to our local population was the Carolina maneuvers in 1941. You had approximately 450,000 soldiers scattered in 16 counties in North and South Carolina.
Crossing a small stream, they emerge onto a Carolina road.
It's one thing to move a company of 120 or 160. A division was 18,000 soldiers. When you're moving a corps, which is 3 or more divisions at the same time frame, you have all the logistical nightmares you can encounter of blocking traffic on the roads, jamming each other up. So these big maneuvers are actually trained to move a combat force into place to prepare for war.
Guns of many sizes and types were used tactically by the field artillery.
But I've heard some of the old-timers talk about having seen the troops actually engage in whatever sort of battle they would have near the corner of East Moorhead Street and McDowell Street, right in Charlotte.
About the 27-yard line. Bruiser Kennard made the tackle. We interrupt this broadcast to bring you this important bulletin from the United Press. Flash, Washington. The White House announces Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor.
Charlotte native Jerry Levin.
I happened to be in the car going to visit some friends, and I heard on the radio that Pearl Harbor had been bombed. And I went back to the house to tell my parents. I said, "Have you got the radio turned on?" "No." I said, "Listen, we're at war."
That same day, Earl Gulledge's father, Jesse Gulledge, a private pilot, took off on a leisure flight. But when he returned,
The last entry into the flight log is Sunday morning, December 7th, 1941. Presumably not long after he landed, the news of Pearl Harbor reached Charlotte. And the next day, he began making arrangements to enter the United States Army Air Corps.
Gulledge eventually served in England, maintaining machine guns on B-17 Flying Fortresses. Charlotte native Charles Richardson went to England as a B-17 radio operator.
The name of my plane was the Good Old Yank.
During his second mission,
we went to Strasbourg, Germany. German fighters really worked us over pretty bad. But that and the flak together changed my entire life. I could see the planes coming at me, and I said, they're trying to kill me.
His last mission proved just as harrowing.
I was hoping we would have what we call a milk run, a short trip with no flak or fighters, but unfortunately it was deep into Germany, and we got hit over Munich, Germany. There was a hole the size of a bathtub in the right wing, and within seconds almost, the top turret gunner said, number 3 engine's on fire.
He says the pilot dove from 26,000 feet to put the engine fire out.
I was saying the Lord's Prayer and every prayer I knew. The pilot told us that needed to get rid of some weight, so he said, anything that's not tied down, get rid of it. You won't need your parachutes, you're not high enough to jump, throw out everything. I said, well, I'm never gonna make it back alive. But good Lord took care of us, and we crash landed on the coast of England. That was a pretty bad day.
Meanwhile, in Italy, Jerry Levin underwent his own baptism by fire, serving as flight engineer on a B-24 Liberator.
I'd never been on a combat mission, and all of a sudden I see this black stuff come up. It's like the 4th of July. Poof, 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 until I hear the rat-a-tat-tat of the shrapnel coming through the plane. I made 5 trips over Palesti oil fields, which was the toughest target in Europe, I think. They had 295 anti-aircraft guns over that target because Germany wanted to preserve the oil fields. And we had about 25% losses each time. So luckily I got through each time.
Oil, a pre-war weak point in the Nazi military supply system, became a bottleneck under repeated Allied blows.
Back on the home front, American industry ramped up to support the war effort, creating millions of jobs for men and women.
This community, like every community in America, was united with the thought of winning the war. And of course, the biggest activity that happened in Charlotte was the shell plant.
The shell plant came into existence in 1942, shortly after the start of the war. The United States conceived a contract with U.S. Rubber Company to buy and build the shell plant, which was a plant to provide naval munition.
The shell plant employed, they say, 10,000 people, mostly women, creating anti-aircraft shells for the 40-millimeter anti-aircraft guns used on all American Navy ships that had anti-aircraft guns.
There was a heavy security force because, well, obviously they didn't want anybody in there. It was explosives. It could be dangerous to an outsider. And the security stayed there after the end of the war to maintain the plant and to keep it secure. They stored munitions there after World War II ended.
While wartime pictures of this shell plant are scarce, this scrapbook from a former worker is a rare find for historian Jack Clay.
It shows the history of that plant, and there are newspaper article clippings that she kept of specific individuals as well as work schedules, their victory pin, and the Army-Navy efficiency pin, the Sterling one that she was awarded in the plant or in her scrapbook. I had the privilege of finding one lady's ID booklet with her photograph and everything in it from the munitions plant. It's hard to find information on the plant unless you do or are fortunate enough to find something like that, like a personal scrapbook.
We were a military town. We had Morrisville, which is now Charlotte Douglas. It was a lot smaller in those days, but it was a very active base.
There were barracks. I counted a picture and I found at least 70 buildings built at the airport that can be seen in a photograph of Morris Field during the war.
During the war days, there were waves and waves of airplanes that flew over Charlotte, early in the morning and late at night, or in the evening. Looked like a an invasion force.
And those planes needed someone to make repairs. Someone like Dot Horn. In 1943, she took the civil service exam while on break from King's College.
When I took that exam, in 4 days they called me and told me to report to Morris Field.
During the war, millions of women entered the industrial workforce for the first time. They did everything from building ships and planes to everything in between. The women in these jobs were commonly called Rosies, a reference to Rosie the Riveter, seen here in this wartime poster. Horn worked as a sheet metal mechanic at Morris Field.
At Morris Field, I think there were P-39s and P-40s, I believe, at that time out there. They were smaller planes, and what we had to do, like at that time I was smaller young person, and sometimes I'd be lying across a rod in the back of the fuselage bucking rivets. And sometimes I would be on the top with the rivet gun shooting the rivets. I would just fill my mouth with the rivets, and I'd pull one out and put it in the hole and pull another one out.
The airfield's newsletter was called Morris Code, and a photographer captured Horn and her friend at work.
I was working on a glider, which we only worked on very, very few of those. And I didn't go in to draw a paycheck. I went in to do whatever I could. It was a time that women were able to help the war effort. I feel like we did contribute as women.
It was on Easter Monday, 1945.
That's the day tragedy struck Morris Field.
I was not quite 5 years of age, and we lived over on Monroe Road.
My playmate, Barry McAnulty, and his cousin, we were playing in the creek behind the houses, our houses, and for some reason we decided to leave the creek and go to the front yard. We heard these aircraft, and they were close and low, so we were thrilled and ran out into the street directly towards them. And one of them came right directly at us. And at first we were thrilled, then we were terrified. And the closer it got to us, the more terror we felt.
These planes were flying very low. And the lead ship, we could tell immediately the right engine was on fire. It was leaving a huge contrail of thick black smoke. He banked off to the right and proceeded down at a very rapid speed. I can remember this like it happened yesterday. It was quite an event for a young kid my age.
Pieces began to fall. We turned and ran for our dear life. And the airplane went right over our heads and crashed behind his house.
He managed to clear Morningside Drive, but from that point on, you know, his fate had already been sealed. The engine that fell off fell into the front yard of a home on Morningside.
It was a terrifying event. I know that the pilot was instantly killed.
His name was Lieutenant Bud Andrews.
Bud was a young man. His father told me that he was not a smoker or a drinker. He loved airplanes from his youth, always dreamed of being a pilot. The day of this accident, it was the very last training flight of Morris Field training. His wife was 3 months expecting, and there was a party that night on the base, and they were going home for 2 weeks. And this tragedy occurred.
Charlotteans Cliff Presley and Melvin Preston would meet years later. Both witnessed the crash that claimed Bud Andrews' life. They collaborated on the 2002 book, Charlotte's Yankee Flyer Hero. Today, the athletic fields at Veterans Park in Charlotte are dedicated to Lieutenant Bud Andrews. Drive along Statesville Avenue and you might easily miss this unassuming industrial complex, but its historical significance deserves your attention.
The cornerstone of that property is the Ford Model T assembly plant, which was built in 1924, and it was designed by the America's foremost industrial architect. His name was Albert Kahn.
Margaret Fleeman completed extensive research on the complex while interning with the city of Charlotte. She says that during World War II, key features of the site, such as the expansive Ford building, access to rail, and room to expand, made it the perfect location for a Quartermaster Depot.
The Army, after they purchased the initial Ford building, built the additional 5 warehouses. While they weren't identical to Ford's model, they used the same materials. They are concrete, they have the steel frame, and they've redesigned the roof system, but they still have windows up in the roof system. The Quartermaster Depot's initial primary purpose was to service non-perishable food to the Army in ample supply, and that was to supply our local camps in West Virginia, North and South Carolina. Because they housed so much product, millions of dollars worth of inventory, they had their own armed guards, they had their own fire department. They also were self-sufficient in terms of lighting and power, so they used the Ford's steam power plant to supply their own electricity and power.
The Army employed more than 2,000 people at the depot, mainly civilians. After the war, it remained open until 1949, with the honorable mission of returning the remains of over 5,000 soldiers killed in action to their loved ones. One of the camps supported by the depot included Camp Sutton in Monroe.
Camp Sutton was a temporary Army camp during World War II located at Monroe, North Carolina. Initially, they would harden units and do their initial basic training at Camp Sutton. It progressed from that until it became an engineer unit training center. And there you trained the engineer units from the ground up and then deployed them off to the war. Camp Sutton was named for a local Monroe boy that wanted to go off into the war before the United States was involved in it.
Monroe native Frank Sutton received flight training in the U.S. Army prior to America's entry in the war. Eager to see combat, Sutton resigned from the U.S. Army and volunteered for the Royal Canadian Air Force.
December 7th, 1941, he was flying in North Africa when he was shot down and killed. When the camp was being located in Monroe, his name went to the top of the list and named the camp in honor of him, Frank Howie Sutton.
Camp Sutton served primarily as a training camp.
Initially, they would become a soldier. They would get their uniforms. They would start the initial soldierization processes of training them to be a soldier. Then they would march them down 18 miles to Paisley, South Carolina, where their weapons ranges were located, and they would spend a week down there doing their weapons qualifications and training, and then come back up to Camp Sutton, where their unit would get its national colors and then deploy for further training or deploy over into the wartime theaters. The Women's Army Corps, the WACs, came to Camp Sutton. They had approximately 68 in the company or the detachment that was assigned to the headquarters area.
More than 900,000 African Americans served during World War II. Several thousand received their training at Camp Sutton.
Mostly engineers. You had chemical warfare companies. I have a unit photograph of one African American, the 53rd Chemical Impregnation Company is what they called it. Additionally, I have a African American unit, it's a dump truck company. Although they're part of the engineers, it was a separate, they were used in construction projects as well as engineer units training. At the end of Camp Sutton, you had 3 African American regiments and no white regiments. So in that time frame, you had about 15,000 African American soldiers and maybe 200 white soldiers at the very end of Camp Sutton.
Jack Clay's extensive collection of Camp Sutton artifacts includes this rare letter with German stamps. It was addressed to a German prisoner of war at Camp Sutton.
In North Africa, when they captured a large part of the Africa Corps, they originally moved them into Alabama, and then they were dispersing the camps around the United States. And Camp Sutton became a POW camp for 700 German prisoners on the camp initially. Literally, you had the POWs you could hire out in the local farms and the lumber industries. This is where they were predominantly used from Monroe. If you needed 4 or 5 laborers on your farm, you could go to Camp Sutton and hire 4 or 5 of the German prisoners, and they would come out to your farms, and there were lifetime friendships established from those interactions.
With so many soldiers from across the country passing through Camp Sutton, the women of Monroe found a unique way to support the troops.
It was called Mothers by Proxy, and the sign would be just saying that, Mothers by Proxy. They would hang on their door, so any soldier walking around Monroe that happened to see the sign, Mothers by Proxy, it meant come on in and talk to Mom. The ladies basically would hang out the sign, which meant open door policy. Any soldier that wanted to come in and talk to Mom, come on in.
And in Charlotte, if a soldier needed a dance partner at the USO,
there was a group of young women called, I believe, the Victory Bells. And they were there to supply a dance partner for the soldiers because, you know, people didn't want to just go and hear music without someone to dance with.
many local companies made an effort to support the troops. Remember Earl Gulledge's dad, Jesse Gulledge? Prior to the war, he worked for Duke Power.
Duke had a pretty comprehensive magazine at the time that highlighted their employees system-wide. When my father was sent to pilot training, then they had his photo shown and a nice little paragraph about him, which was, it was quite personable, and Duke was known for that.
During World War II, the nation made a full commitment to support the war effort, and this meant civilians at home often did without. As resources became scarce, the government introduced rationing.
A lot of sacrifices made during the war. There were shortages of metal, of rubber for tires. All those things were poured into the war effort.
In civilian life, we had a lot of rationing. We had coupons to buy shoes just as we needed them. We didn't have the option of going and buying a pair of shoes to match an outfit.
The gas rations were handled by stickers on the car, which designated a car as either a private car that didn't have a right to any special amount of fuel, only a certain amount per week, or cars that were fulfilling some special purpose and could use more.
My father worked for the post office. He was a civil service type. And as such, his ration card for gasoline was a little more than the average John Q. public. However, every 2 weeks, he had to park his car and walk to work.
You know, there's that Bugs Bunny cartoon where his plane is plummeting out of the sky and it stops inches short of the ground, and he shrugs and says,
"We ran out of gas." Yeah, you know how it is with these A-cards.
Also in high demand, scrap metal.
There were collection efforts made all over America and in Charlotte to collect used tin cans and any other source of old metal. In fact, a lot of old cars undoubtedly were junked. Find the metal to make weaponry.
This photo shows former library director Hoyt Galvin receiving a pennant for Charlotte's salvage efforts.
he was made the head of the salvage board. For 2 months in 1942, September and October, Mecklenburg County averaged over 100 pounds of scrap per person. So, I mean, a lot of this might have come from business, but I mean, that's pounds and pounds of stuff collected by every man, woman, and child. And I mean children, because this is something that children could do.
Along with rationing and salvage, the government encouraged families to raise their own food in what were called victory gardens. But for many at home, the greatest hardship of all was sending their loved ones off to war.
These parents would send their boys off, and you can imagine sending your child off and not having any idea whether you would ever see them alive again or not, because there were so many soldiers killed during that war.
Dot Horn shares the significance of this small flag with 2 blue stars.
They were for Marvin and John, my 2 brothers. It showed that we had someone in the war effort that was out there fighting for the country. You would drive down a street and just about every house would have one of these flags.
Before it was over, this global war claimed an estimated 50 million lives and finally ended with the surrender of Japan in August of 1945. Dot Horn remembers how she felt when her boss made the announcement.
He said, "The war's over, go to town," and the sirens were blowing and the church bells were ringing, and to this day I get chills all over because it was Jubilee, and we all got uptown and we took over the streets and we marched the streets, and it was just so wonderful. It still brings tears to my eyes till today. It was just a great time when that war ended. It was an era of history that America pulled together, and I know that there'll never be another time like that.
It was a time in history when cities and towns across the nation like Charlotte and Monroe played a key role. Veterans like Jerry Levin, Charles Richardson, Jesse Gullidge, Rosies like Dot Horn and the 16 million American men and women who went off to fight remind us of a time when personal sacrifice for the greater good united an entire nation. Thank you for watching this episode of A Trail of History.
A production of PBS Charlotte.